Welcome to the Pastor's Podcast of Cornerstone Church of West Los Angeles, the first episode ever of the Pastor's Podcast. This is a podcast designed for our church family to communicate about the things most important to us and allow you to get to know parts of our church family a little deeper. I'm Pastor Scott. I'm here with Pastor Brian.
Hey.
And we're going to actually spend this episode just talking about, we're going to talk about this podcast, and we're going to talk a little bit about podcasts in general, how we should view them, how do we think of them, how we should listen to them, and actually maybe how we hope that you'll listen to this one, what it's for. So, Brian, I mean, can we just give a little bit of backstory as to how this came about, like why we're here, why we decided to do something like this in the first place?
Yeah, it's all Matt's fault. I mean, it started a long time ago. It started back when we were trying to figure out how to help people get access to a lot of the information for our classes, and we came up with what Matt affectionately calls a pod class, where you deliver the content and audio in sort of podcast format, and then meet several times. And from there, once we had the equipment, we realized that we kind of had this hole in the way we were able to communicate certain things about the church to people. A lot of that was you, Scott, was kind of realizing like there's a lot of things that are going on. There's a lot of pastors that we have that maybe not everyone knows. We're not like a tiny church anymore. And so not everyone knows all the things that are going on. And there's just ways of being excited about the church and getting to know the church family and getting to know kind of the various things God's doing through the church that could go entirely unnoticed by people without some way of communicating it. And this seemed like a great one because when you're driving in your car, when you're doing dishes, things like that, you can be getting caught up on those things, getting to know your pastors better, getting to know what's going on in the church better, and kind of just getting to, worship what God's doing, or worship God for what he's doing in the church that you're a part of.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And actually, I love that you mentioned worship, because I think it's actually our corporate worship services that a lot of this came out of, because
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the ways to think about this is kind of like an extended God's activity. I mean, these are the things that I think we've come up against a number of different times that we really want to be able to explain more fully who we are as a church. We want to be able to explain more fully why we do some of the things we do, and even how we structure things. We want to let you know, we want to let the people in the church know about what's going on, maybe even in other areas of the church that they're not necessarily privy to, but they would be super encouraged by, and that it would that we think the Lord wants them to know about. But nobody would let me do like a 30-minute God's activity.
I said no. It was a hard no.
Hard no on the 30-minute God's activity. And so this is like if you want to ever push expand on God's activity, just like click on expand the God's activity. That's what this is meant to be, really, in a lot of ways, is a opportunity to hear in a more in-depth way some of what God is doing in our midst. I mean, when I think about what I hope people gain from this, I hope that actually each one of these episodes is in some ways the start of increased conversations among us about who we are, about what's important to us as a family, and in the things that we're doing. I think with a church family the size that we are, we have to look for different ways to communicate. And instead of making you try to read something really long, instead of trying to get you to watch something that's longer, we know that right now, at least in our culture, in our world, in a lot of ways, audio is king. And if we could give you something that you could listen to while you are doing the dishes, while you're driving to work, while you're working out, it would just put on your podcast list. It might actually be a perfect way for you to get exposed to more and more of what God's doing in the midst of our family.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's easy to forget how much you need certain reminders about stuff like that. There's ways you don't realize you need encouragement until you get it, and you're so glad you did get it. Yeah. And it's, you don't need reminders about what's going on in the church, or different things that are happening, or different things we're gonna talk about in terms of seasons of the church or values of the church. There's ways that you don't know that you're missing that until someone puts it in front of you, and then you realize, oh, that was really cool. I'm so glad I got that reminder that sort of galvanized me or encouraged me or pushed me in a direction, helps me know how to be more a part of the church, makes me feel more connected. and makes me feel more able to live the way God wants me to live kind of in my life as part of this church. And that's what I think this podcast can be too, is just a way of that being kind of delivered to you automatically. It kind of shows up in your podcast feed. You put it on, and all of a sudden, this thing that you didn't really realize you needed or would really enhance your day, your life, your worship, your perspective, all of a sudden does that. And that's a pretty cool thing to be able to do.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, some of the things we're going to be talking about, even just over the next few months, we're going to be answering questions like what is Lent as we enter into this season of Lent. We're going to try to unpack that a little bit more. We're going to talk about what it means to be a multilingual church. Pastor Ara and Pastor Jose help to even process through together some of the things that we talk about a lot as pastors, but that we don't have as much of an opportunity to talk about with all of you. And that's, how do we live out life as a multilingual church, not as three distinct churches? Why don't we just have individual churches, an English church, a Spanish church, a Farsi church? Why are we one church, and what does that mean? What does that mean practically in our lives? We're gonna look at our global partnerships and kind of be able to explain what a key global partner is and give you an idea, make sure you know who our global partners are, how you can be praying for them, how you can be involved with them and supporting them. And we're also going to try to provide an opportunity to allow you to get to know some of our church leadership better. I'm hoping I think actually next week, we're going to jump right in with Pastor Bill.
Get ready for some great stories.
Meet Pastor Bill. and
he's got a lot of stories. They're good stories.
We're ask 2 questions. He's going to have stories for all of them, and it'll be great because you're going to get to know. And that's where, I think if you can get to know Pastor Bill's stories, constantly when he's telling me them, I'm like, I wish more people could hear these things. And again, nobody will let me ask him to tell a story in God's activity. They're like, nope, we just can't do it. But this provides us like opportunity. This provides us like a context to do that. Or even, some of our staff, like our director of family ministries, Jeremy. And Jeremy's going to come also talk about what life groups are. Life groups are the small groups designed for our youth and have been a huge blessing. There's so many things God's doing in our church and in these life groups right now. And we want you, whether you have kids or not, we want you to hear about that, be encouraged by what's going on. And so those are just a few of the types of things. We're going to look at our core values. What are our core values? Why are they important to us? And hopefully address timely things too as they pop up in the life of the church, in the life of our city. Be able to unpack them and discuss them kind of from the unique perspective of our church family together. And really, we want to make sure that this is designed for our church family. The goal of this podcast isn't to, be a new kind of big evangelical or whatever label you want to use podcast for the world, but it is simply designed specifically, if you're a part of our church family, this is designed specifically for you, in order to think through and be encouraged in our context in West LA in 2020. And we're excited about what the Lord's going to do with that. And so as we think about that, as people engage with this podcast, as they maybe engage with this podcast on their list of podcasts, as this comes up in their feed and they listen to it for 20 minutes in between all the other different podcasts they listen to. I think, Brian, it begs the question about how we should think about podcasts, how we should listen to them, like how we should engage with them. If we're going to start a podcast, we want to encourage people to listen to it. How should people be thinking about all the content, especially all the audio content that they're taking in every single week? It's no longer just like a one sermon on a Sunday as far as like audio content that's going to encourage you, that's going to teach you. This is a format that a lot of people are using extensively in their lives.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been surprised at how, like, now that you can stream video, it seems like there are plenty of people who just don't quite care. They'd rather have a bunch of podcasts. And I know people who listen to like 20, 30, 40 podcasts.
Hey, don't call your wife out like that, man. This is a family podcast. She's going to listen to this.
She is going to listen to this. And it's what's interesting because I'm married to her. I listen to some now because of that. But she's engaged in all these things and is learning all these things. So you see a lot of the upside of this whole podcast phenomenon, because what you get is a chance to learn things and experience things and hear things you would not have otherwise. And so you see that in various kinds of podcasts, from like a Radio Lab and the kind of NPR style things to Christian podcasts. I mean, they come in all these shapes and sizes, and that's stuff that you didn't have access to before. So you have these kind of personalities and people and content that you weren't able to process before and really think about at all. So that's like a big upside.
Yeah,
I think
for
it
sure.
is.
For sure. I mean, and I think in a lot of ways it allows us to be, like a lot of things in the world today, it allows us to be selective, right? So instead of just like listening to the radio and you put it on and you just get to listen to whatever they decide to talk about today, with podcasts, we get to be a little bit more selective on topics, on the authorities we listen to, on content, which is actually why I think a local church podcast, as strange as the concept might sound at first, actually makes a lot of sense, because it does have a limited audience, but it was designed specifically for the people here. So if you're listening to this, if you're going to choose to listen to it, you can curate the things that you're listening to. You have the ability to curate the things you're listening to, or you shouldn't just listen to like whatever the next thing is. And hopefully a part of that package is the dynamics of what's going on in our spiritual family, and putting that on the front burner of your mind as a engaged member of it.
Yeah, there's a way that what we're doing is a kind of corrective in a sense. I mean, we're not trying to like fix things, fix the world of podcast, but
we're going to fix podcasts.
As much as these things are helpful, and they really are, some of the downside is with some of that curation that you're able to do, because when you're hearing voices from everywhere, there's a kind of way that you're also hearing them from nowhere. And so you end up with these kind of contextless ideas and stories and thoughts that are never tethered to anything in your actual life. And not all the time. There's some that do that, but it's kind of rare because they're coming from everywhere. And so that becomes a pretty big issue. You end up kind of lost in a world of ideas and theories and stories and concepts and entertainment or education or whatever that is not in any way moored to what you're doing, to the life you're living. And you have to work really hard to make those connections sometimes, because they're doing it to a really wide audience. They can't do that for you necessarily. And so that's kind of a problem. And so to have a local church podcast is to have something that is giving you information, stories, education, whatever, from a more like a tethered context to the life you're actually living. Like, you're going to see the people who were telling the stories on Sunday. You're going to interact with some of the ministries that were being discussed like throughout the week. Like, there's ways that these things are going to be part of your life in a way that a lot of other podcasts won't. Yeah.
I mean, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're also in that same vein. It's not only contextless, but it also has very limited depth, right? Because you can't, it doesn't encourage you to like go research on your own, right? Yeah. It's designed to kind of present you a finished product, to kind of present you and take you on the journey, but it's also very, it's very developed. It's very produced itself. And so, and in that way, it's not like a book where you're going to meditate on it, sit on it. The thoughts are going to come and they're going to go, and then the next thought's going to come. And hopefully what we're going to do here is point you back to those relationships, point you back to those conversations, point you back to even those passages in the Word that you can go to for deeper study, for deeper understanding, to and then this will be an introduction in a lot of ways, as opposed to just a conclusion, as opposed to something that doesn't have a context isn't simply presented to you, that can invite you to go deeper into your life with God and deeper into the life of the church.
Yeah, I mean, you're a lot of the appeal of podcasts and a lot of them are story based, whether that's journalism or just sort of finding interesting stories, and they tend to have maybe a lesson in them or something to learn from them, but they always end up having to reduce what's going on for the sake of the presentation. Whereas for this kind of thing, like when you meet Pastor Bill, like you get to know him in all of who he is, like after that, which is not true of any other kind of podcast. That's a really cool thing. You get to go participate in the things that are being talked about instead of hear them from afar. I think that's a really helpful thing.
Yeah. All right, so I don't want this to go super long. This is just an introductory podcast. So just as we wrap up, how about one last question? So we talked about the benefits of podcasts, kind of the potential drawbacks, but how should we listen to these? Like, is this something we should, encourage people to, get out their notepad and like take notes? Should they just kind of do it on the fly? Like how do we listen? How do you think we listen to podcasts well?
I think it's a great question because no one really asks it. Like, and it's like with all technology, like I think when something makes something convenient or just kind of immediately fits into your life, you don't really ask if it's good or not. You just kind of do it. And that's kind of contemporary technology in general. And so asking the question is a good thing. I think one of the upsides of podcasts is the convenience of it, is the fact that you can, while you're doing dishes, while you're driving the car, these sort of stereotypical ways people listen to podcasts, you're learning during that time. And that is a pretty cool thing in one sense, but it also can have a built-in drawback that I think is worth thinking about, which is if you do that all the time, you literally have no time left where you're not being talked at. So like doing the dishes, driving, like there's very few times when you're not receiving something, kind of passively receiving something that's being brought to you. And so there are times when I would suggest that you shouldn't be listening to a podcast while you do the dishes and just be forced to be alone with your own thoughts and the dishes. There's like a spiritual health to that just constantly having noise in your life can form you in really weird ways. And so in terms of how to listen to a podcast, I think the very first thing we ought to know is, well, sometimes you just shouldn't just cuss. Like just to have some space and not have more noise, because it's part of a much larger issue we have with like filling all the time and feeling productive no matter what, even if it's not actually that productive. There's just ways in which it can form us into an interesting kind of person that I think is not fully formed when you're constantly just needing noise to survive. You can't sweep the floor unless you're listening to something. At the same time, if you sweep the floor while you're listening to something, it's not necessarily a bad thing. You just want to be cognizant of the way you're using this. Is it something you're using to learn, to help your life? Or is it something you're using to add noise, to add distraction, to add entertainment value because you just kind of need the hit of entertainment to make it through whatever chore you're doing or whatever commute you have or something like that. So being aware of that is really helpful. And that kind of gives you maybe the way you ought to be listening to these things, which is, conscientiously. I think a lot of other podcasts, you do have to do some work to make them more than just entertainment. There's nothing wrong with being entertained by something. That's a valid thing. But if that's all you're doing kind of ever, you might want to think about that and say, how do I do the mental work, the listening work to take some of these, because some other podcasts talk about really important stuff. Am I actually taking that into account and doing anything about it? Or am I teaching myself that it's okay to hear a bunch of really important stuff and then do nothing? That also forms you weird. So for this podcast, I think the way to listen to it is to try and listen to it conscientiously, try and actually, pay attention, and also to try and figure out, how does this help me worship God better? How does this help me engage my church community better? How does this help me live the life God has for me? Because just like God's activity, this is a way of highlighting what God is doing. And so if we don't ever respond to that, but we listen to it, we end up teaching ourselves that that's normal, is to hear what God's doing and do nothing about it or not, respond to him in worship at all. So it's really a forming issue that podcasts have that we want to be aware of.
Man, that's such a great point. It's interesting. It makes me think of just last night, we were in our family devotions. The story we came across was the story of Mary and Martha. And it's well known, and it's like a theme in my life that come back to again and again, like when I'm just so tempted to just be going and going and going like Martha, and the need and the desire to sit with Jesus like Mary. And what was interesting to me about it, it was kind of convicting in the moment, and I'll talk about that real quick. But what's interesting, as you were talking, I think sometimes we treat podcasts as like the golden ticket that can get us to do both, right? Like while I'm preparing dinner, I can also sit and listen to Jesus, right? Like I can also sit and think about something, and it's like productive. Like we've solved being Mary and Martha all at once. Like
that's pretty good.
We can do it all. But the reality is we can't, because even when Jesus rebuked Martha, it's not like she was out of earshot. Right? It's not like she wasn't able to hear what he was saying or what conversation was going on. What was so what he commended in Mary was her desire to just sit and to do nothing other than listen to him. And so I think when it comes to this podcast, when it comes to any podcast, I think this ought to be like the second thing you do after prioritizing your time with the Lord in prayer, in quiet each day. And it's the type of thing that I'm tempted to substitute for that. Like, I'll listen to a Christian podcast, I'll listen to a devotional, or I'll listen to a podcast from my church, and that way I can kind of get something. But God is inviting us in. He's inviting us into deep relationship. And I think our hope is that this will point you and remind you to go back to that, not to replace it with that, and also that it'll encourage you to go deeper in relationship with those in the church, and it'll encourage you to go deeper in relationship with us and with other people that are on the podcast, not as a replacement, so that it's not like, oh, now you know us through a podcast, so that's what you need to know, but that hopefully it'll encourage you and point you to a deeper relationship with God and a deeper relationships with one another in the life of the church. And so with that, we hope that you'll subscribe and begin on this journey with us as we kind of dive into Cornerstone's Pastors Podcast. We look forward to talking to you again next week.